This is iFi's iDSD Valkyrie, and it has so many features as a portable DAC and headphone amplifier and preamplifier if you like. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, just look at the number of ports on the back of this thing and the number of buttons and switches on the front and on the top. And there's a whole menu system I could get into as well. iFi has crammed their IEM match in the bottom as well. They have so much stuff in this, and there's remote control that, well, it's kind of overwhelming. However, so instead of saying where to begin in terms of features, I'm going to tell you the story behind this instead and my experience using it from when I agreed to have it in for review through to now. Now, it was released back earlier in the year, and I had planned to review it after talking to someone at iFi at CanJam New York. Now, there's a bit of a story behind this because back last year, iFi had a bit of blowback against their published specs for the iDSD Diablo. That's the red DAC and amp that is quite popular. They had been claiming over 5 watts of output power, but actually it wasn't. That 5 watt measurement, and the 5 watt measurement actually out of the Valkyrie, is from the shortest instantaneous peak measurement they could possibly derive, so they could get a nice big number. However, its real power output is 2.2 watts, and the Diablo is somewhat lower. I think it's about 1.2 watts RMS. And while those specs are fantastic, I mean, this with 2 watts of power is excellent, they insisted on using higher numbers for advertising the Diablo. So I said, after the blowback, they assured me they'd learned their lesson, and I agreed to review the Valkyrie. However, when they published the specs, there was that 5.7 watts again, and originally without even saying how the measurement was derived, and only if you did a click reveal did you see the actual 2.2 watt RMS power output. Now that's ridiculous because the power output of 2.2 watts from a portable device is fantastic. RMS is of course continuous power, not peak power, but iFi's peak power measurement wasn't even to standard, which is really frustrating. So that kind of put a sour taste in my mouth. There were also some issues with firmware and some bugs, and I don't like to review things while they're buggy. I tend to wait till they've fixed at least the initial bugs and then put out my review and say, well, this remaining bug, if there is one that exists, may well be fixed in a firmware update. That often happens with me and other manufacturers. And that makes my review more relevant to people actually looking to buy the product, of course. So then I waited till those things were fixed. As I was preparing to shoot this review, I turned on the Valkyrie. It actually was designed with some thoughtfulness, and the volume ramps up as you turn it on so that it doesn't just jump into full power if you have a signal going. I thought that was really cool, but after it ramped up to the top volume, it crashed and went into a boot loop. And it turned out that it was trying to connect to the Nexis software and going into a crash loop. And when I restarted, then I found that the Valkyrie started working again. So that was an unexpected thing that ended up delaying the review once again. But once I got it going, it was an interesting device to use as it does have a good amount of power for even fairly insensitive headphones. So for example, I like to do a lot of testing and listening, say with these Dan Clark Audio Expanse headphones or the E3s or other similar headphones, because they do put a bit of pressure on the amplifier to provide current and voltage as necessary, especially in very dynamic music. But going through some of the features that it has, they have crammed in everything anyone could possibly want into this. For example, from the left you have your power USB port and you have your normal data USB port, which can be switched in the menu system to allow charging through it if you so desire, or you can keep it separate. Then you have your optical or coaxial digital inputs, your RCA and 3.5mm outputs, and then rather confusingly dual in or out, line in and out 3.5mm and 4.4mm balanced outputs. So the latter, for example, I have for a 4.4mm connector going into this DCS Lena amp, which I was using to compare the driving power with the driving power of the Valkyrie, which you've probably seen me normally do with the Shit Audio Mjolnir. On the front side, if you're familiar with iFi, then you'll imagine that this is a giant griffin, and you probably have much the right idea. You have a push-in power button, 4.4mm, 3.5mm headphone outputs, and buttons to control the digital filter, DSD upsampling for the smaller button, and on the end, the input and K2 button, which is a little bit troublesome because you can sometimes want to switch on the K2 feature and then press it for too short a time and switch the input instead. But with all of that, you can actually tune your sound along with the digital filters to everything from very kind of sharp and clear to very sort of warm tube-like sound, and maybe a little bit softer and more forgiving. And that makes this very flexible if you have a wide variety of music you listen to, where sometimes you want a little bit softer and more forgiving, and sometimes you want sharper and clearer. And also you can tune the music even further. You have the usual extra bass button, you have extra space, and extra presence, and respectively they give a lift to the bass, the extra presence gives a lift to the mid-range, and the extra space makes everything sound more spacious. So between all of that, you have so many options that it's really kind of hard to know where to begin. So rather than talk about the DAC, the headphone amp is still pretty powerful even if you ignore all the numbers, true or not true, in that headphones I plugged into it seem to be driven pretty well. I think that when you have quieter, more gentle music like jazz or classical, that I found that the competence and detail to be pretty good and pretty up there, which is interesting because they're using basically the same amplifier setup that they've been using since about 2012 in the Black Label series, which was designed by someone who no longer works for them. So they've taken a design which is fairly long in the tooth, but they've got the maximum out of it in terms, I believe, maybe of detail and driving power. I only found it to be somewhat overwhelmed when music became very complex and very aggressive, say some rock music, or even the Black Keys, some of my favorite tracks from them. Then it tended to become a little bit shouty and aggressive. And that's something I noticed, especially if I then listened at the same volume level using the Valkyrie as a DAC to an amplifier like the DCS Lena amp, where things were more relaxed and delivered with the same dynamics, but without the shoutiness and the compression that you get when an amplifier has been pushed to its limits. So I do feel a little bit the amplifier in the Valkyrie has been pushed to its limits in that regard. The DAC, on the other hand, I think is quite good. Of all the DACs I've had in here which have had adjustable digital filters, changing the digital filter in the Valkyrie and the Pro iDSD, which I had in some years ago, are the only ones that have made a significant difference to the soundstage. For example, the GTO filter, which is one based on an MQA type filter that iFi tends to like, tends to sound more forward, brings the vocals more forward and the instruments more forward and in your face. However, they do have a transient align filter, which is something like a high tap linear phase filter, and that does make the imaging sound more precise and accurate. But then you also have other filters such as non-oversampling, which they call bit perfect, their standard filter, which I have no idea what that is, and an apodizing filter as well. And switching between them, you get slightly different sound stages and slightly different results. The bit perfect filter with, say, CD quality music, that's 44.1 kilohertz, does end up becoming more forgiving, especially on more aggressive music, which can be a nice bonus. Whereas the transient aligned, again, on the other hand, can be sharper and more clearer, with the GTO and apodizing filters having slightly subtle differences depending on what you're listening to. On the other hand, you can do things like DSD upsampling, either to DSD 512 or 1024, and the differences between those two settings are so minor it's not worth trying to nitpick into, but they do very slightly soften the edges of the transients on the music. DSD upsampling can be hit or miss depending on what device you're using. Very high quality DSD upsampling filters, such as from HQ Player, don't have that excessive softness that some DSD upsampling gear does. And the iFi tends to be somewhat closer to actually high quality DSD upsampling, where the transients are only slightly softened and the slight edges are taken off. It can work out very well depending on, again, what filter you use at the same time that you're doing the DSD upsampling, because both the PCM filter and DSD filter are being engaged at the same time. Then you have the K2 feature. And now that system I'll let you look up and investigate yourself, but with CD quality music, it is designed to supposedly reproduce the harmonic, well maybe not the harmonics, but the high frequencies taken away by downsampling from the original master. Then there's the K2 HD, which engages in circumstances I'm not entirely sure of, which supposedly only works with the GTO filter, but actually worked with other filters engaged, which is designed for high-res music or high-res upsampling, and I'm even not quite sure what that is supposed to do. But what it did do is it added that kind of tube flavor that you got in the Pro iDSD, which this seems to be based upon, where it became, with CD quality music, a little bit more harmonic and a little bit softer. So in one extreme, if I engage Bit Perfect, DSD, and K2, then I had a very soft and mellow presentation of the music. But on the other hand, if I switched everything off and left it in transient align, I had a very sharp and clear presentation of the music instead, and playing around with different options, everything in between. For example, listening to When I Get My Hands on You from the new Basement tapes, which has low bass rumble, which combined with the aggressive vocals from Marcus Mumford, is a real test for amplification, And the Valkyrie comes across as a bit shouty, something which I confirmed by connecting it to the Mjolnir and also the DCS Lena amp. Not surprisingly, using the Valkyrie as a DAC to either of the amps gives more space to the vocals and instruments, and the Valkyrie's soundstage from its inbuilt headphone amplifier in the highest output mode being more cramped and the thump from the low notes being less distinct, even at the end of the track after the vocals stop. IEMs too were handled as always impeccably by the Valkyrie because they have the IEM match mode which works in the lowest gain setting. For example, I have in here Fio's FX17s in here for review. They're almost like headphones to drive, having fairly high sensitivity, but even classic IEMs like Campfire Audio's Solaris, I could use the IEM match to keep the gain right down and keep the hiss away when using those. Now with Fio's FX17s, they have a strong V-shaped sound signature, and the top end can be unbearable on some tracks, such as Morphine's The Night. The sibilance is unbearable out of most gear, but with the Valkyrie you can select the bit perfect or non-oversampling mode, which rolls off the top end nicely, while switching in the K2 to add a little bit more warmth. Say if I listen to some classic Miles Davis, I can switch to the transient align filter, and there I get the sharpness and clarity so I can hear the instruments clearly, or even the apodizing filter, which in that track spreads the soundstage a bit. If either are too spread out, the GTO filter brings the mid-range in closer on speakers and can work nicely with headphones that have a wider soundstage, such as some planar models. The only thing is, with the Valkyrie at this price, is its nearest competitor, the Hugo 2. And I think the Hugo 2, without all the fancy features, gives better detail and flow to the music overall. And it doesn't, to me, require any fancy filters or tuning to get enjoyment out of any kind of music, whether it be aggressive rock or smooth jazz or anything in between. It also has equally sufficient headphone drive that, at least to me, doesn't become shouty when you turn the volume up. One of the cool features that the Valkyrie has that I initially thought was very appreciable is that you can control all the menu features, everything from the settings in there to things such as whether you have the line out and headphone amp engaged at the same time via an app on a smartphone or actually another DAP, which is how I primarily used it. This also allows you to remotely update the firmware without having to use any fiddly software as you did in the past with other iFi gear. However, there was one thing that kind of annoyed me. When I looked up the location of the domain for this app, it was in China. And so basically, to use this app, you have to register an account on a server in China provided by Alibaba, and that may not be comfortable for everyone to do. So the problem is, if you want to upgrade the firmware on this, unless you contact iFi and get a specialized app, or if they let you get a specialized app and let you directly download the firmware to upgrade via Windows, you're going to have to register an account to do the firmware upgrade. Now that may not be a problem for some people, but for others it will be. And I don't think they completely thought this out when they decided to do this, as it seems their software team is entirely in China. So in the end, that left me feeling that the Valkyrie is, well, I have mixed feelings. As an epitome of everything they can do, it does almost a perfect job, but there are some niggles that may be showstoppers for some people. I don't think they needed to provide other than the RMS output for the Valkyrie, as it's more than sufficient. And they picked marketing at a ridiculous number over just being straight up to their customers or even potential customers. But aside from all of that, if you're looking for a high-end portable DAC amp, I think its only real limitation is they're still using that amplifier tech from back over 10 years ago. And when you start to get really busy rock music with demanding headphones such as the Dan Clark Audio models, that's when it starts to run into its limitations. But a lot of the time, you can tune things as you like with IEMs or headphones and have an enjoyable listen whatever gear you have. And then it also does duty as a transportable unit with the included case, or as a desktop unit which you can park on the desk, set it to not charge the battery to full to preserve its life, and then just use it as a fairly minimal desktop system for headphone listening. If you're someone with a Valkyrie, do post your own impressions of them, as I'd like to hear from you. Have they been good? Has it been working reliably for you? How has the amp been? And how about everything else? Do let me know what combinations have worked for you and which ones haven't been so good. As always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.